Everyone has an idea of what personality means, but it's something which is very open to individual interpretation.
Your personality traits are your core habits, the things that kind of define you as a person. What personality psychology is trying to understand is that variability in the way humans behave and the way they think and feel.
Often we find that humans wear masks or they pretend. We compromise our authenticity so often.
I do think humans, one of the qualities that we have as humans is the ability to tolerate incongruity in ourselves and in others. So I think this is a feature of humans, not a bug. And so we're quite capable of putting on an act, even though it's not who we are. There's a really simple 4-item personality measure you can use if you're going to meet somebody for the first time. And the first thing you should ask is their story. Then there's your skills. Then there's what you want to do with your life. And then, the last category is personality traits.
The human or the person is always the same. And yet we find that their personality changes according to whatever role they're playing at that time.
Different environments afford different opportunities for personality. And so the different roles in your life call for different aspects of your personality.
Which personality traits seem to matter the most for success?
How do you define success?
Our guest today is Dr. Brent Roberts, one of the leading researchers in the world on personality development across the lifespan. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois and past editor of the Journal of Research in Personality. And his work has been central in reshaping how the field understands traits like conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness, not as fixed labels, but as patterns that can and do change over time. In this episode, Brent helps us to get very concrete about what personality is and isn't, and how it relates to the kinds of creative lives people actually lead. We talk about why traits matter for creative persistence, risk-taking, and collaboration, but also why the old story that people don't really change is misleading. He walks us through what we actually know empirically about personality change, what tends to shift, when and under what conditions, and how that intersects with creative work, motivation, and well-being. If you've ever wondered whether your personality helps or hinders your creative life, this conversation offers a framework for making sense of your own patterns, how you tend to think, feel, and strive, and for experimenting with changes that move you toward a way of working and living that feels more aligned with who you really are. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Brent, and welcome to the Creativity Dialogues podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. What we are looking at the Creativity Dialogues is the various ideas and the human condition and how it connects to the topic of creativity. And I'm particularly interested for today's conversation because the personality is actually the crux of the human. And so it'll be very interesting to really sort of figure out or try to understand that aspect of the human, which then enables whatever he creates or makes.
Well, thank you for the invitation to talk to you. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to the conversation.
Likewise. So I'd like to just begin with what first drew you to psychology? Tell us a little bit about your childhood and the experiences that shaped your interests.
There's so many different ways of answering that question. I just told an audience today that I was the son of a Marine in the U.S. military, and that there was nothing you could do to irritate an officer in the Marine Corps more than to become a psychologist. And so my career could be construed as one very long adolescent protest that I haven't gotten over yet. That's one way. So that would be somewhat unfair to some of my positive mentors. I had a very influential teacher, Jim Hansen, who I love dearly, and who took me under his wing when I was young in high school and fostered my interest in psychology and trying to understand my fellow teenagers back then and people in general. And I would have to give him credit for my interest in the field in general. And it was a wonderful thing to be able to explore the ideas with a caring mentor like that. The teachers can make a big difference.
Because you mentioned this, I would really be interested to know that do you think that you seeked out a mentor, or did he find you? Because a lot of people say that we wish someone would mentor us, but find that we never find that happen to us. So how did that happen for you?
It was a combination, most definitely. I mean, at the time, my parents had separated, and I was looking for, some, let's say, male energy to help guide me at that time. And he was assigned to my class randomly, somewhat. And when we, let's say, first met and first started talking, there was definitely an immediate bond. And so which is something that, and I know that's the ineffable part of mentoring. You don't know how it's going to happen or whether you're going to connect. And you really do want that connection to happen because mentoring can be such a joy and such a gift to both parties. Because I know now, being chronologically challenged, that there's nothing more joyous than being in a mentoring relationship where you really can help someone. And at the time, I very much needed help. And I got the sense that Mr. Hansen very much enjoyed helping me. So it was a lot of luck and some opportunities thrown in there.
Yeah. Growing up, were you naturally curious about people, or did that curiosity develop with time?
I think that curiosity developed with time. I was definitely curious, and I was very scientifically oriented. I loved nothing more than the National Geographic magazines that used to come in the 1960s and 70s to the house, and reading through those types of books, and also reading and ideas. So I was very nerdy. I have to admit, when I was young, I really liked ideas. I really liked thinking about the world. I really liked science and trying to discover things in the world that were truths, so to speak, that could then be used and help us to understand things. I didn't necessarily resonate with psychology until I met Mr. Hansen. And then at that point, I was under the false impression I would become a clinical psychologist and help people. It took me a few years to figure out I was more curious about people than I was helpful. So I changed my focus when I got older to doing research on people more than trying to help them.
Right. What misconceptions about personality did you have before becoming a researcher?
Ooh. Well, so naive. I would be hard pressed. I think the one that I confess to now, which is somewhat poignant, is I was motivated to go into the field of personality psychology because at the time I thought it was the opposite of clinical psychology. I thought, the institute I went to work at was focused on optimal human functioning, with creativity being one of the primary topics of focus. And my advisor, Ravenna Helson at the time, was an expert on creativity and understanding creativity. And I thought I was going to study how people would be more effective than suffering, which is typically what happens in a clinical field.
Right.
And I was under the impression at that point that what I was studying as a personality psychologist was not clinical psychology. 30 some odd years later, we now know that basically they're the same thing. And so, and I've reconciled this and become quite good friends with many of my clinical colleagues, and we have very wonderful conversations. But my impression that I was doing something the opposite of clinical psychology was wrong. No, the dimensions that we discuss in personality psychology are the same dimensions that clinical psychologists work with. They're just working with people who are having problems with those dimensions in their lives, whereas we're usually in personality psychology not so concerned about pathology or suffering as much.
What has studying personality taught you about yourself?
Many different things. So to give me the opportunity to understand myself better, where I stand in relationship to many different things. It helped me a lot as a parent, because it gave me insights into how kids develop and how little effect parents have on their kids, which
Yes.
for me was somewhat liberating, because the cultural imperative, at least in the United States, is that parents are the primary driver of what their children turn out to be, and it's not the case
Trust
empirically.
me,
So
that's a global perception.
is
That's
it okay? Because
everywhere. Yeah,
I'm
unfortunately.
not. And the empirical data has never backed it up, and so knowing that was quite liberating in some ways, because I knew that my kids needed to be respected for who they were, and they were developing into their own personalities and their own personhood. And I was able to see that and respect that, instead of, feel, let's say, deeply responsible for every bad thing or
Hmm.
good thing that they did.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah,
that I think was something that I very much
yeah,
appreciated learning.
that's so true. Now, let's move to your main topic, personality. If you could actually explain what we really mean, I think everyone has an idea of what personality means, but it's something which is very open to individual interpretation. It would be really nice to know the spectrum of the word.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I could spend a long time answering it. I'll try to be brief, at least, and let you poke at my definitions a little bit. So, at the very simplest level, it's an acknowledgement that each of us is a different person from each other. That if you look at a group of people, they're not the same, even if they come from the same culture, if they're the same age, if they come from the same community, if they're the same gender. Everybody's different from each other, and those differences are all around us all the time. They define us in some respects, because the problems we face in life are often other people, and it's often other people who are different than us. That's what personality psychology is trying to understand, is that variability in the way humans behave and the way they think and feel. So which is that's a sufficient definition. If you want to take it at a very broad level, that's what a personality psychology is trying to understand. Once you have that as your foundation, your yeah, your color palette, then you can paint a picture, right? And you can divide that up into more specific aspects of personality. I'll be happy to talk about that, but let me stop there
Yeah.
if you're
Uh,
satisfied or
yeah.
unsatisfied with that definition.
Yeah. No, that's actually the most simple and understandable definition. Um, what aspects of a person fall under the term personality, and what aspects don't?
Okay. But, I'm going to answer the question in multiple steps, and I should say that my answer is it's particular to my position, and I have an opinion that may not be shared with my other colleagues. But I like to think of personality as the way we handle the challenges that we face as humans. Primary challenge, first one would be how to relate to other people. Are you going to get along with them? Are you going to fight against them? Are you going to try to lead them? Are you going to be a follower? Are you going to be nice? Are you not going to be nice? And then these are fundamental features of humans, and the individual differences in the way we meet those challenges. That's personality. The way you approach your work, which is intrinsic to creativity. Are you going to be a hard worker, persistent, diligent? Are you going to be capricious and erratic? Are you going to be creative? Are you going to be innovative, curious? Are you going to be concrete, closed in the way you approach your work? And then how do you handle the stresses that emerge from those situations, right? Relationships don't go as well as we want them to. Work doesn't go as well as we want it to do. We lose our jobs. AI takes over our
Hmm.
job, and we have to figure out what to do. How do you handle the stress of that kind of situation? That's all the emotional stability side of things. So that's what personality is typically focused on. When it comes to creativity, I really like to make the point that there are big categories of things we think about as personality. that I think are really important to consider. I always like to say that there's a really simple 4-item personality measure you can use if you're going to meet somebody for the first time. And the first thing you should ask is their story, like, how did they grow up? I grew up in California to a military father and had influential teachers, right? That's my story, and I have chapters and things. And I was raised in the 60s and 70s, and lived through the late 20th century and the like. That's an important feature of everybody's personality is the really unique experiences. Then there's your skills, like what are you good at? And especially with creativity, you have things like, are you really good with numbers? Are you an excellent painter? Can you draw? Can you compose music? Are you verbally creative? You can come up with poetry and writing and the like. And so there's skills that people can bring to bear on things that they do in the world. And that's really critical for creativity. And it's also a key component of personality. We traditionally think about that as like IQ or something like that. But I think with creativity, you've got all the other domains. Then there's what you want to do with your life, which is your motives and goals, your aspirations. I have dear friends who've wanted to be musicians since they were 12, and they've never achieved it. It hasn't stopped being a goal of theirs, right? But
Yeah.
it's what they wanted, and it's what they wanted to do.
It's like an
And then,
intrinsic motivation.
yeah, and maybe even extrinsic. You look cooler if you're
Yeah.
fronting a
Yeah.
band. And then the last category is what I think of as our personality traits, which are those ways you manage or handle relationships and work and stress. And those we have another organizational system for. But those are 4 big domains that capture pretty much most of the individual differences that we care about within personality. We usually don't consider things like physical features as personality. That's just
Really?
biology
And
says
that's such a
no.
misconception because people actually think that the features are a very important distinction. And so that's something
If you're big,
interesting
if you're
that
small, yeah.
exactly everything. I mean,
Man or woman,
that's,
all of
yeah.
these things are presumed.
Hmm.
It's often surprising for people to find out that something like gender differences are really quite small when it comes to something like personality and personality traits, and so they're not as important. But we usually just, you can, if you think of gender, for example, you can think of it as a personality dimension if you put it on a dimension as opposed to a categorical system, right? And so if you start talking about gender fluidity or gender in a psychological sense, femininity, masculinity, then it becomes a personality thing. If you're talking about it as the physical features of male and femaleness, that's a different thing. So we usually don't consider those things personality.
Mm. How is personality different from terms like temperament, identity, or character?
For temperament and character, I would say that they're one and the same. Those words have, let's say, intellectual baggage that go with them. So, temperament denotes that it's something you got from your parents and their genes, and that you got it early, and it's fixed by genetic factors, and it doesn't change.
But Brent,
Character, on the other hand, yes,
sometimes,
sorry.
when we talk about temperament, you find that even children that belong, I mean, siblings, they're very different temperamentally. So they have
Yeah.
the same background, I mean, often the
Yes,
same
of course.
parents, and yet they're different. So
Yeah.
how do we understand that?
Well, I agree with you. So this is why I don't use the terms temperament or character, because I think the meaning is inaccurate in terms of what happens with people. So kids do emerge differently from one another from birth on, but
Hmm.
there's not really much information you gain from an infant's personality to what they're going to be like when they're an adult. And so if there may be genetic factors that contribute to how you start life, they're not leaving a big signal. There's also the fact that the personality doesn't, and sorry for this term, read true. While you might get your personality in part from the genetics of your parents, it's random. And so your brother and sister can have different personalities because the parents' genes are being put together somewhat randomly. And when it comes to personality, you don't get a really strong signal. And so that's one reason why brothers and sisters and brothers are different from one another, is because I like to call it the genetic joke of the family. We're just as likely, if not more likely, to be different from one another in the family. It causes lots of distress because we think they should be the same, both because parents have the genes and they raise them the same way, and they don't end up the same. So that's why I don't like the term temperament, because there's not very much evidence for it. But if you look at the content, like when somebody's a temperament researcher, the content they're looking at is very similar to what a personality psychologist would look at. It's just the assumptions are different. I don't assume that, what I study is fixed and unchanging and starts from birth and doesn't go anywhere. Character is the opposite in some respects. It's saying that there are certain qualities that you only gain through experience. And so we often associate them with kind of more of the moralistic traits, like being conscientious and responsible. And then the interesting thing there is, well, those traits are just as genetic as any of the temperament traits, like extroversion and openness to experience. And so this distinction that people make in using character and temperament really isn't there. And so that's one reason why I don't like to use those. They talk about the same content, but they have meanings that are not necessarily accurate, at least not from a science perspective. The third term you use, it, character, temperament, and identity. I mean, I like identity because it gets at that narrative aspect of personality, where it's getting at your story a little bit. It's also your own view of yourself, right? We have the opportunity to view ourselves and to understand our personality from our perspectives. I like to think of that as your identity. It's not the same thing as your reputation, which is what people think about you. And it's really good to keep in mind that those are two different things, because your view of yourself doesn't always mesh with what other people think of you. And so I do like the idea of identity being your perspective on your personality.
What are the factors that actually shape personality? Is it a matter of nature or nurture? How do you see it?
Yes. So it's something of a false dichotomy. Both factors contribute. We've had lots of let's say hard lessons in this space. I think we had a hope in the end of the 20th century that we'd find the gene for extroversion, the gene for creativity. And we really were wrong with that expectation. This doesn't mean that there aren't genetic factors that contribute to our personality. But what we found is that any complex trait like extroversion is informed by thousands of differences in the genome. And those 1,000 differences in the genome have to interact with a developmental environment for them to be realized. They don't just make you extroverted. You have to have opportunities to realize extroversion by interacting with people in a certain way and getting the opportunity, for example, to interact in certain ways. And in the absence of those environments, the genes mean nothing. And conversely, we found that there is no blank slate out there either, that there actually isn't any construct that we study in psychology that isn't genetically informed in some way. And so it's really this interplay in this combination. It's a little bit frustrating at this point because we don't have easy answers. I like to make the argument or make the point that each of us is a tapestry with lots of threads. Some of them genetic, some of them environmental, some of them combinations of them. And we have lots and lots of let's say, threads coming to us from different sources to make us who we are. And your parents are sometimes put up as the big thing, but they're not. They're just one small factor that contributes to who you are. And then there's other things like your friends, your siblings, your broader family, the community you're in, the experiences you have, health problems or successes you might have as a child. All of these things add up in small ways to who you are as an adult.
Are there key life experiences that tend to shape people more than others?
Yeah, the extreme experiences we know are telling, right? If you experience severe abuse and severe loss in your life, those are going to leave marks on who you are. Probably the most surprising thing is if it's not a really extreme event, most experiences we have leave very small effects on our personality. That's been one of the big surprises we've discovered. So, when you get married, what school you go to, whether you get a good grade in that math class, something like that. These types of events have really small effects on what our personality is. Which is a good thing, because then you can keep in mind that the world is not going to come to an end if you get a B in that English class. But when it comes to what we expect, we really have a naive perspective that life events like getting married, having kids, moving to a new town are all going to have profound effects on you. And I'm not saying they don't. They just don't have profound effects on your personality. They have effects on your story, obviously, and the like, but not on your dispositions, not on your major motives and the like. So then that's been a very surprising empirical finding for us.
One thing I was curious about is, the human or the person is always the same. And yet, we find that their personality changes according to whatever role they're playing at that time. So, if you're at work, you would be a different person. If you were hanging out with friends, that same personality would appear very different. If you're parenting, if you're with a spouse, if you've just traveled to a new place. So what kind of a this kind of a role play, or how do we change, or how does our personality seem different, appear different?
Well, there is definitely the case that the different roles in your life call for different aspects of your personality. So you don't want to act conscientious with your friends at a party. You don't want to be working hard while you're supposed to be having fun. And so different roles and different environments afford different opportunities for personality. And what you see is in that context, for example, if you're out at a club with friends, that's calling for extroversion and calling for openness and calling for joy of sorts. You're having fun. And then within that context, you'll see that your friends vary in the extent to which they take advantage of that, right? And that is one and the same when it comes to personality. So we don't think of it as separate. In many respects, your personality is how you manifest it within meaningful contexts. And the big social roles, like our relationships and our work and our friends, afford opportunities for different dispositions to come out and emerge. And then, so we don't see that as a bad thing. It's very consistent with the way we define personality. It's also the case that people still maintain some consistency, even when it's in a role that wouldn't necessarily mean that you should act that way. And so fun-loving, extroverted people, when they go to work, are often the ones who are getting people to go out afterwards and the ones who might be cracking more jokes at work and getting people involved in social activities at work. And so we do see continuity in how they behave across those roles. The roles afford you opportunities for different aspects of yourself to come out. And we also think they help us develop, so that when you go into a role and you fill it out and embody it over a long period of time, it gives you the opportunity to develop yourself. And some of the roles of young adulthood, for example, give young people the experiences necessary to become more conscientious. Because we don't demand it of students that they show up every day and on time and the like. But then when you go to your first job, if you don't show up every day on time, you don't have a job. And so
Right.
that role change gives you the opportunity to manifest a different level of conscientiousness. We find oftentimes that helps people change their personalities.
Yeah, I was wondering that, does personality shape our environment, or does our environment shape our personality?
Yes and yes. I mean, people select environments or get selected for environments because of who they are. So, like I said, the extroverted person is going to be seeing other humans as a source of fun and stimulation, and they're going to be more likely to invite people over for a dinner party or invite people out to go do something interesting. And so they're creating the environment themselves. And then an extrovert will get into a social interaction, and because they're extroverted, they'll talk. And then that will engage other people to talk back. So it reinforces their extroversion. So they create their environment to some degree. And then if you are then given the opportunities to do those things, whether or not you're extroverted, if you get more opportunities to do them, you can acquire those qualities too. I always tell the story about going from being a busboy to a waiter. I was a very quiet, hardworking busboy. Didn't talk to anybody, but it wasn't my job to do so. Then when they gave me the opportunity to be a waiter, which I had to fight for, mind you, because they said I was too quiet, my extroversion emerged, or I kind of trained myself to be more extroverted because you got better tips that way. And so that role afforded me that opportunity. So we really do find both. We call them selection and socialization. You select yourself into situations and you also get socialized or changed by them.
I wondered about the word authenticity because often we find that humans wear masks or they
Yeah.
pretend.
Yeah.
We compromise our authenticity so often. So what kind of shape does the personality take when we do that?
It's an interesting question. I just got back from Japan, where that distinction is very, very prevalent in their culture, right? They do such an amazing job at being polite to each other and to others in their community, whether they feel that or not. And I do
Yeah.
think humans, one of the qualities that we have as humans is the ability to tolerate incongruity in ourselves and in others. So I think this is a feature of humans, not a bug. And so we're quite capable of putting on an act, even though it's not who we are. And if you think about it, a lot of the roles we embody as we transition to adults ask us to do that. And then it becomes a really interesting question. If you have to act polite for years on your job, does that make you a nicer person if underneath you're not? Or do you learn to act and you learn to play a role that is not who you are? And obviously based both on anecdote and some data, when people are put in that situation over time, it tends to cause stress. And so they might choose to leave that job, or might choose to go to something different so that they can get closer to their authentic self, or they might change over time and their authentic self becomes different. So authenticity is a bit of a precious concept, right? It's an indulgence of sorts for people who have the autonomy to do that. Many people don't have the autonomy to do that, and I think that needs to be kept in mind. So
I wanted to move now to, can people really change? One of your most influential findings is that our personality changes more than psychologists once believed. Why
well,
did so
again,
many researchers assume that one's
assume that.
personality is largely fixed?
I think they wished that it was that way. Back to the definition of temperament versus personality. I mean, people wanted to believe that personality was fixed. It made things easy on you to think it that way. And to be honest with you, most lay people believe that personality is one of the most fixed things that we have. And that made it a relatively straightforward scientific question. See if it changes, and it does. And so, and I usually don't argue with my data. And we were able to put together a lot of good studies, and many other people have too. And it's really clear what happens over the life course. People get more confident in themselves. They get nicer. They get more conscientious, and they especially get more emotionally stable. Now, the changes that you see are pretty profound over the life course. Grandparents are very different from grandchildren, right? But within a 5-year period, most people don't go through dramatic changes. So the changes that we see are really incremental, almost imperceptible probably, but they're all in this positive direction. And they definitely emerge over time to make it so that somebody who's 40 years older than you is going to be a different person. And that's really important. And many of the qualities are quite good. And the data has been really clear. And the data has been clear even across different countries too. That this is the case. So you do change, you do grow, and you do develop over time. The other surprising thing was that it happens more often in young adulthood than it does in childhood. I think we think in most societies that our job is to create the personality when they're children and make it better when they're adolescents and then let them go. And what we're finding in the data is that, well, when you let them go is when they actually change. And so that's when they start acquiring different attributes, which is interesting.
Yeah,
So
because I found this in my own family, that my younger sister was a complete introvert, very shy, she just wouldn't speak up. And she had a complete personality change when she came into the 11th grade. Anyone who knew her before and after just would almost not recognize that it's the same person. To date, none of us in the family are quite sure as to how this complete
What happened?
transition happened. What
Yeah.
happened? And she herself claims that, well, she says, I just grew up. But I think that's a simple way, perhaps. I wonder always when these major changes happen, because I was coming actually to my next question, which is, why do some people change dramatically, like sometimes completely, while others remain relatively stable?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I don't think we have very good scientific answers to it. Part of the problem is that it's relatively rare. So your sister's story is compelling, and I've heard stories like it.
Goodness.
One of my favorites was an individual who heard my talk on conscientiousness, who came up afterwards and said, "Yeah, Dr. Roberts, my son is not conscientious. He lies on the couch all day, doesn't help around the house, he refuses to get a job, he doesn't get his haircut." The classic complaints about a teenage boy. And
Mhm.
then I gave a similar talk a few years later, and who happens to be in the audience but the same woman? She comes up to me afterwards, and I feel a little bit sheepish because I've given pretty much the same talk. But she says, "Dr. Roberts, I have to tell you, my son's a changed man." And I was like, "Well, what happened?" And she said, well, she didn't know, but overnight, he got off the couch. He started cleaning up around the house. He got a job. He got his haircut. He did all the things. And so she asked him, she said, "Son, what happened? What was the event?" And there was no event. He turned
That's the
21.
thing. Yeah.
But you see, he turned 21. And in his mind, that was an event. Because in his mind, he had said to himself, till I'm 21, I can do whatever I want. But when I'm 21, I have to be an adult. And he had a really rich picture of what that meant to be. And so when he hit that age, he was like, okay, now I just have to act a different way. And it's a beautiful thing in some respects because it does show the flexibility. I don't think that happens very often. It's the problem with studying dramatic changes like that, because I don't think people have such clear-cut philosophies. So more often than not, we're less articulate with what we expect ourselves to be and the changes we want. And I think that's why most people don't change dramatically most of the time. We're more kind of going along and being more unwitting victims to what's going on in our lives than being in such control. So
Yeah, yeah. If someone, though, wants to become more disciplined, more confident, and less anxious, what actually works?
well, for the latter, for anxiety, for example, we know seeing a competent and well-trained therapist can help. And we know that it is related to changing your personality. These are recent research that we did in the last decade. And so you can get help, and a therapist can help you, especially with that. The other factors in personality don't have as easy of a vehicle, or like, I mean, in our societies, therapists are well known and the like. But if I want you to be more conscientious, it's a little harder, right? Because we don't have therapists who are there dedicated to make you conscientiousness. They're mostly there to make you less neurotic, and they help with that very, very nicely. But there are job coaching teams that can help, especially leaders who have the money to hire them, to work on things like that. Some of my colleagues have started programs. Nate Hudson, who's down at SMU, has a volitional change platform where if you're interested and you want to change your conscientiousness, he provides a menu for you and a program where you visit the program once a week and work through goals and behavior change. And so we're starting to bring online systems that would help somebody change their personality. But I would want to say that it's not easy. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time. And you really want to be forgiving of yourself. It's not going to happen overnight. And the changes that happen are relatively incremental. You're not transforming yourself overnight. You're working on things, and in working on things, you can actually do something about it. Olga Kazan wrote a book that's called Me But Better, about her efforts to change her personality. And it's a wonderful book, and it has basically a prescription for the ways you might want to change different aspects of your personality. Highly recommend the book for people who are interested in that question.
So that might actually help to answer a related question, which was, are there common mistakes that people make when trying to change themselves?
I think the expectation that you can do it overnight, or that your partner can, right? We
Yeah.
think we go into relationships sometimes thinking, well, my partner's not perfect, but I will change them.
I'll
And
change them.
that,
Yes.
I would highly recommend not believing that, because if you also think about it, like, we're almost none of us are trained to know how to change somebody's personality, and I think what we think is all we have to do is explain it to them, which is not, that's like the worst strategy you could use. So I mean, for better or worse, sorry to use this as an analogy, you want to think about changing somebody's personality like training a dog or training an animal. When we do that, we use positive reinforcement, punishment, right? We use the schedule, and we do partial reinforcement schedules over time to get our dog to learn how to do something like, come to us or sit or lie down. Humans are not any different. And I think what the mistake we often make as humans is thinking that all you have to do is explain it to somebody, and cognitively they'll figure it out. That's a huge mistake. We're just like dogs. We need to be rewarded or punished, and we need to be rewarded and punished patiently over a long period of time. Because we're not special. We might have a brain, we might have verbal, understandings of things, but we don't respond well to just information about things. It really helps to give somebody good, positive rewards for changing behavior very incrementally. And in that respect, I think people often make the mistake that they can just explain things to a child or to a partner or to a coworker, and they should change. And then you get very frustrated when they don't, and that's on you. Because that wasn't a very good strategy.
Yeah.
And that's the strategy we use a lot.
Two words that just came to my mind were words like tendencies and habits. Do they kind of figure in this equation?
Yeah. I mean, I think the researchers will take issue with this, but I think of habits and personality as pretty much the same thing. Your personality traits are your core habits, the things that kind of define you as a person. Obviously, you can develop very specific habits of exercise and eating certain things, or do meditation at a certain time, that are very, very specific. It's possible to do that, but your personality is the thing that you do automatically and across different situations. And so the conscientious person will develop the habit of exercise and eating right and meditating easier than the person who is not conscientious, right? And so they're very, very similar to one another. So I would be reticent to make the really strong distinction, which many people do, that they're different. They're very analogous.
When it comes to who we are, what aspects of ourselves should we try to change, and what should we make peace with?
I think my general recommendation is to make peace with everything to start, right? To some degree, the only way you could come to change yourself is to accept who you are now and understand who you are. If you have the wrong view of who you are, you deny that you're a certain way. Most common thing we all think we're nicer than we are, right? And if you are not nice and yet you think you're nice, you're not going to do a good job of changing it, right? So I think the first thing is really coming to understand who you are,
self-acceptance,
and then accepting it for what it is, right? And you might come to the conclusion that you don't need to change. So, but unless you understand who you are to begin with, it's really impossible for you to figure out how and why and whether you want to change yourself. So first thing is to accept yourself and the people around you for who they are. If you want to change your partner in a certain way, first thing to do is come to terms with who they are as a person. Learn to appreciate that. That might alleviate the desire to get them to change. But then if there's still the desire, then I think almost any quality can be changed. There are some that are probably harder than others. We haven't yet seen that. I with one caveat in the clinical side of things. The things that are more physiological and really tied into your identity across different contexts are really hard to change. Drug and alcohol abuse. Yeah, because oftentimes abusing substances becomes part of your identity. You have friends who are doing it too. You organize your life around that. And clinicians will tell you that it's really hard to change that. Also, eating disorders are really hard. And if you look at eating disorders and how they develop, they're usually developing early, and they're usually developing in relationship to the society that the child is embedded in. And as opposed to other qualities, they're usually getting rewarded for it, at least to begin with. Oh, you look great, right? Because they lose weight and they're not obese. And so those qualities, for example, are harder to change, and it takes more work. They can be, but you probably need to be a little more sober in your approach to that. But when it comes to other things, neuroticism, extroversion, creativity, and the like, I mean, I do have to admit, at least in relationship to the topic of your podcast, I have yet to come across what I find to be a satisfying way to make somebody more creative. We can work on little components of it, but to get that spark, that ability to bring really different ideas together and to create something new, man, that's hard. And I haven't seen really convincing ways of changing somebody on that dimension. But yeah, I want to be convinced otherwise.
I know. Now, if we move to the science of measuring personality, most people have taken some kinds of personality tests. How do psychologists determine whether a personality assessment is actually valid? How are the criteria constructed and operationalized?
Well, I apologize, at least initially, for the fact that most of the measures we have are self-report measures of statements. Those are really proxies for what we're interested in. I always like to make the argument that if I really want to know your personality, I'm going to put a little camera on your shoulder and I'm going to follow you around for 6 months and see how you behave and hear what you articulate your thoughts and ideas and see how you emote in reaction to things. That's getting at somebody's personality. When we ask people questions on an inventory, it's a really poor proxy for that, right? Tell me whether you talk to a lot of people, and we don't have any real calibration with that. The surprising thing is how well it works. So, and in that respect, we do have systems for validating our measures, and well-constructed measures work more than they should in some respects at capturing what people want. But we'll do things like, okay, if I'm interested in extroversion, I'll ask a lot of different questions related to it, either generated by a theory about it or just my observations. And then I'll make sure it relates to other measures that already exist for that. I'll ask their friends and family to rate them on extroversion and see whether that scale actually relates to that. I'll look and see whether it relates to objective things that aren't subjective, that should be definitional. Like if extroversion is related to leadership, and do you end up in more leadership positions in your work? And the answer is yes. And so those are some of the steps that we take. Then I have to make sure that it's not the same thing as other things. So one of the problems we run into is using the same words for different constructs or different words for the same construct. So we really want to map out, triangulate what we're measuring, measure it in lots of different people, look how it converges with things that it should, look how it predicts things that it should, and make sure that it's not redundant with something already that exists and might go by a different name, so to speak. And so that's a very quick picture of what we do if we're trying to validate a measure. And good personality measures have gone through that process.
What do you think of some of the popular personality tests like the Big Five and Myers-Briggs?
The Big Five, I'm fine with. They tend to be shorter than they should be. If people the Big Five is a wonderful thing. I view it as a working organizational structure. And they call them the Big Five because each of them is big. Extroversion is made up of a family of
Can you
traits.
explain the fives?
Sure. There's extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism slash emotional stability, and openness to experience. And they've been found empirically in almost everything we look at, whether they were generated from a dictionary, theoretically, or whether we generated the questions based on a deep theory. We seem to always run into the big five. And it's a really nice organizational structure. It's a good, really quick, really good way of understanding a person. Are they outgoing or introverted? Are they nice? Or are they mean? Are they hardworking? Or are they less hardworking? Are they anxious and depressed? Or are they calm and serene? Are they creative and innovative? Or are they concrete and seek closure? Those are 5 really good questions to ask somebody, and you'll learn a lot by asking those questions. Go into the big 5, you can get much more fine-grained assessments. And so I prefer those longer measures. But it is the case that if you wander around the internet, you're going to find relatively brief measures of the big 5. Just don't mistake that for getting a full, complete picture of your personality. And the big 5 is generated out of years and years of good empirical work. So it tends to be respected as more valid than most other measures. And I think it deserves that respect. But again, keep in mind, it's just a self-report measure. It's the real proxy for what we're interested in. So it's a good place to start. I wouldn't want to end there when it comes to understanding who I am. Some of the other more popular measures are usually less well-regarded. The MBTI is one example of that. It's very common, for example, to find people criticizing the MBTI, especially academics. But it is also the most widely used measure in existence. It's been given to millions and millions of people. And there's a reason why people like the MBTI. And I think it was a brilliant marketing move on their part. When they created it, they purged it of any negative qualities. So basically, when you take an MBTI, you're getting 4 of the big 5 and no neuroticism. I remember I gave the basic personality measures of the MBTI to a group when I was young in Oklahoma. And they came back and they said, we really like the MBTI, but this other test, this big 5 thing, it's mean, it's ugly, it has these negative things. And it was like, well, that's because humans aren't always so good. And so on the scientifically derived side, we're ready to acknowledge that sometimes we're not the nicest people, and sometimes we possess negative qualities. You're going to get that with the big 5. With the MBTI, you're only going to get happiness and joy and positive things. That reduces its accuracy, that reduces its validity. It's not completely invalid. Because it actually, if you look at the questions, they're very similar to the big 5 questions. They just made very specific choices about how it was created to purge it of the negative things. And then their propensity, for example, in that measure to cleave it in half and do types, utterly unjustified. It appeals to people's desire for simplicity, but it's not the way personality works. We don't break into discrete groups. But nonetheless, people like that. So most of the tests that you see out in industry that are really popular are usually suffering from some of these problems, so to speak. So we don't use them in our research.
Yeah, when you spoke just now that, the not so nice sides of our personality, I just thought of something that I heard recently where, they said that the human is the most dangerous animal on the planet. Because, we think a lion, a tiger would be more dangerous, but they are just acting out of that's their biology, that's their primal, that's how they're meant to live. But a human consciously, with full intentionality, does things that, he or she knows aren't right.
And as a group.
Against the laws of nature and against a group. And as a group as well, yes.
Yeah.
It's absolutely.
Yeah. That's profound.
You've done important work on personality and life outcomes. Which personality traits seem to matter the most for success?
How do you define success?
Good question.
So if I'm interested in somebody, who's going to be creative, I'm very much interested in openness to experience, right? It is the core of predicting people in creative occupations. Um, it doesn't predict much else. It doesn't predict better relationships or occupational attainment or educational attainment, for example. In fact, it's a little negatively correlated with educational attainment. End up being an artist, you don't need a degree. You can go out and quit early and start your band and do those things. When it comes to occupation, like traditional occupational success for like leadership and management, you want extroversion and conscientiousness. At least in the U.S. In the U.S., we tend to, like extroversion and like putting people who are extroverts into leadership positions. We like our leaders to be dominant and assertive, and then if they're hardworking and organized, it's a bonus. When it comes to many different outcomes, if you construe success as living a less painful life, in which you're, let's say, rewarded both in relationships and in health, and the like, conscientiousness is key. So it predicts staying married longer. It predicts doing better in school. It predicts better health outcomes. It even predicts mortality. So if you care about those things, you should focus on that. If you want to avoid many of the forms of psychopathology that clinical psychologists are focused on, neuroticism is your predictor. And to the extent that you can avoid being neurotic, you're going to avoid suffering from depression and anxiety attacks and the substance use disorders and all the different things that are manifest in clinical psychology. Nice people tend to do really well. At least they're really well regarded, but it has mixed effects on different aspects of success. So famously, for example, men who are nicer don't usually earn as much money as men who are not so nice. Not surprising, I should say. On the other hand, the reason why isn't because they're pushovers or anything. It's because they just don't care about money, which is cool.
Right.
But people, if you're a nice person, you're going to lead a better life because everybody around you is going to like you better. So that's not an insignificant thing, but it's not as strongly related to traditional success indicators like occupational attainment and earnings and the like.
So, are there situations when being highly conscientious becomes a disadvantage?
I've been desperately searching for one for a long time. There is I think there's a desire on the part of those of us who are not conscientious to think that our conscientious colleagues are somehow suffering. And this has been a relatively popular idea in some of the corners of psychology, right? And it was a very Freudian idea that you're over-controlled and it's going to have some negative effect on you. We've done a number of studies in this space to try to figure that out, and it's not true. So we have not seen negative consequences. There might be places where it may not be as, let's say, good to be conscientious. Creative occupations might be one, all right? But it really has to do with different aspects of conscientiousness. If you're really rule following and conventional in your orientation, which is an aspect of conscientiousness, it's hard to be creative. And so if your goal is to go out there and make your mark as an artist, that might not be good. On the other hand, being persistent, which is another aspect of conscientiousness, is really important for artists because they fail, because society doesn't give them their due early and often, right? And we don't support creative types well in most societies. We don't give them the resources that they need or deserve. And so if you're persistent, then you're more likely to succeed. So it's a more complex story there. There aren't as many situations that we thought would exist where conscientiousness would be bad. And if you find some, I'd be all ears because we've been looking for them for a long time.
So, is conscientiousness a word we could replace with morality?
No, I think you could replace it with grit.
Really?
Which is the same thing. And I think so. And I like that as a way of characterizing what conscientiousness is. it isn't moralistic in most of its aspects. So being an organized person is not moralistic. Being persistent is not necessarily. Yeah, we've got some very immoral people who are way too persistent, right? And so it's not necessarily a moral domain. The conventionality and rule following aspect of it is an interesting case, right? Because sometimes we put those together. The moral people are the one upholding the rules of the tribe, and whether they're religious or Confucian or whatever is respected by a culture, and that's conscientiousness. So there are aspects of it that could have moral, let's say, realizations. Broadly speaking, though, not as much as you would expect.
Got it. Yeah. No, thanks for clarifying. Now it's absolutely clear. What traits do you think society undervalues, and which do they overvalue?
I think I alluded to this to some degree. I do think we undervalue openness and innovation and curiosity, and we do a lot to squelch it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a potential problem. I think there have been wonderful. There's a recent study where they gave creative types universal basic income in Ireland, and it not only helped those individuals, but it helped the communities too. So it had all these positive effects. And I think we stereotypically abandon creative types and leave them to their own devices. And that means that you have to be born rich to help manifest that. Or it's your avocation. You paint on the side, or you do photography on the side, and you don't get to actually do the thing that you love to do. So I would love to see us invest more in creativity and openness as a rule. I think in the United States we love bombastic extroversion far too much. But I've just spent 2 weeks in Japan where it's not valued, and Norway last summer where it's not valued. And so you see these communities where it's not as important, and they do pretty darn well. But in the States, we tend to overemphasize that as a positive quality, and then it's fine. But I don't think it's actually as good as people want it to be.
I was in fact just coming right to this, that openness is associated with creativity. And is it something at all that people can cultivate?
We do have things, skill sets like brainstorming and thinking outside of the box. There's a huge school of thought in the design space about how to foster more openness in people. And they put you through lots of tests where you are asked to come up with lots of different options for a simple object and the like. And so there are ways that we have to actually hopefully do something like that. I haven't seen empirically much evidence that any of them actually work. And so I'm not satisfied yet endorsing them as techniques. This doesn't mean they don't exist. And there is creativity training and the like. But I think it's a harder task than most people appreciate.
How do personality and motivation interact in creative work? And how does this vary based on whether the motivation is intrinsic versus extrinsic?
Extrinsic. Yeah, it's a great question. So we do think of them as different, and both of them acting on the outcome independently of one another. So you can be a really open person, but have no interest in being an artist. And so if you don't have that intrinsic interest in doing those activities, your openness isn't going to be manifest in that. So you really do have to have the motivation to do those things. It really helps for it to be intrinsically motivated, because what that means is you come back to it over and over again. And we know from our research that people who practice things, whether it be musical instruments or art or poetry or any of those other artistic endeavors, you tend to get better. And so if you grow bored or tired, and you don't like doing it over and over again, you're probably not going to reach the asymptote of skill that you could reach, right? So it really does help to have that. The really fun thing is in some corners, it's best to be both intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. So it doesn't hurt to want to, win the Grammy Award or win the scientific accolades, which are very extrinsic, but nonetheless also provide some energy for you to do the things that then create those creative outputs that we all value. So, and those are independent from the dispositions like openness that also contribute to your creativity. And so it is really important to have both.
Are there personality traits that help generate ideas but hinder implementation and vice versa?
Whew. That's a fascinating question. I mean, I don't know of any good, research-based answer, but we do know, for example, that, you have to have ideas to have creative ideas. And so if you generate lots of ideas, then that's one of the important precursors. But your ability to then integrate ideas, if you don't have that ability, if you're only dispersive, you're only coming up with lots of different things, then you're going to have problems.
Why are people often poor judges of their own personalities?
Well, you only have one perspective, right? And you're inside it all the time. We're really good when we can see things outside of ourselves, and we don't have many opportunities to do that. We also don't have many opportunities to get feedback on our personality, right? Because of politeness. We don't usually tell somebody point blank, you're not a very nice person, because that's going to be a provocative thing to say to somebody, right? And so we don't have institutions or cultural norms, at least not in the United States, for giving people that kind of feedback. I just created a platform with this in mind, where you can take a personality test and then send it out to 5 of your friends, and they remain anonymous. And then you only get the information when 5 of them have done so, and then it's aggregated, so you can't tell who said the bad things about you. But what you do is you get your reputation, and you get an aggregate of these things. And I did it for that very reason, because we don't have that opportunity. There are not many institutions like when you get your performance evaluation from your boss or something like that, but it just doesn't happen. That we have institutions in our societies where you're confronted with what your behavior is like. There's certain cultures that do better. Germans are very blunt and direct. They'll tell you what you're doing wrong or right immediately. People in the US, not so much. People in Japan, not at all. So there might be cultures that afford the opportunity, but we don't really have institutions to do that. And I think that that's how you would figure it out. So,
how much of who we are operates outside conscious awareness? What role does the preconscious play in personality?
Well, I like that question, because I think by definition, in many respects, personality is preconscious. I could describe it as non-conscious. You don't think about your personality; it comes out, right?
Right.
And so I think by definition, that's what it has to be. This doesn't mean you can't observe yourself. Like, I know I'm irreverent compared to other people. I know I'm extroverted compared to other people. You see enough that you can make these conclusions. You can see enough behavior. That doesn't mean that there aren't blind spots. And I think it's a really important question. I'm not going to go so far as to be a Freudian and say that the majority of your personality lies under the surface, unapproachable, with the exception of getting your dreams or using a projective test or something. I don't believe that anymore. But I am quite willing to say that there is always a component of our personality that we might not see. And again, back to the fact that we never get much feedback on it, especially the qualities that are less desirable, you might not want to know. You might not want to acknowledge it. And other people might not want to tell you. And so that leaves the blind spot where you might not see it. I don't think it's a huge component of our personality. I do think there's certain people with certain personalities that have it more than others. Classically, we think narcissists have it. And I think in some cases it has to be true. On the other hand, we've done some research, and we asked the narcissist, "Hey, do you know you're a narcissist?" And they say, "Oh yeah, I know I'm a narcissist." And consistent with could narcissists think their motivation in life is to show you that they're great? They believe that they're great, and the rest of us are just they got it. We got to catch up. And so
Right.
they're totally okay with seeing themselves as narcissists because they're great, and we just have to figure it out.
Right. You
And
know
so,
why I asked you this question was because very often I feel that if we think in terms of creativity, the most important thing is the idea. I mean, where did the idea come from? And very often, people just get a spark, almost like they just feel they landed onto something. They don't even know, they never deliberately went out to seek that idea. And something just reveals itself to them. And I feel that that's when the preconscious is operating before you actually evaluate that idea and you become very conscious and you decide that yes, this is a good idea or perhaps not a good idea. But I feel it's from the preconscious that just the origin of that idea or a flash of something just comes
an
seemingly
insight.
out of
So,
nowhere.
so the, yeah, no, that resonates very much, and I like that. But with the caveat that it happens more often with people who have been, intrinsically engaged with the information, right? They're
Right.
deep in. So it's not the case that I would come along and walk into my friend's lab
Yes.
in physics and have an insight
No, no,
that
no.
is suddenly
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
wonderful.
No,
It's somebody
absolutely.
who's steeped in it, right? And so
Yes, yes.
it's pre-conscious in the
100%.
sense that you might not be thinking about it, but there's so much thinking that's gone in
Yes.
to
Yes.
preparing, the
Yeah, yeah,
mind
yeah.
to make that connection. So
Yes.
I do like it, and I do think it's been documented that that's the way creative insight works. But it also is built on just obsessive
No, it has to be.
thinking, and
It has to be about something about your topic and
yeah,
your
yeah,
seeking. So you've been seeking for a long time, and somehow the answer appears, perhaps in a way you didn't quite imagine it to. But definitely, it does come from that entire background. How much control do we actually have over our behavior?
wow, that's a good question. I
I
mean,
know, I've always wondered that how much control really do we have? Do we just act because we're just compelled or it's just instinctive? Do we really have control? Any control, in fact.
well, I like to say that you have responsibility, whether you think you have control or not, right? So you might be impulsive, and by being impulsive, you do damage to other people. Um, and you might not be able to control that, but you bear the responsibility for it. So, and to the extent that we have the ability to think about these things separate from the acts, which humans do, um, you bear the responsibility. You, so in my mind, in that case, that's a person who, okay, I can't control my impulsivity. I can't control my urge for taking drugs. And so when I'm in the context of drugs, I'm going to take them. And that person lacks control. But because you are aware of it, which all of us are, you still have choice, right? You can still avoid the situation. You can still not put yourself in the proximity to drugs. And in that respect, I still, it might be the case that there are certain situations where you lack control, but you still have responsibility. You still have the ability, given the nature of human nature, to do something about it. So I'm not very sympathetic to the
Mhm.
arguments that we lack control of ourselves. I do think that much of what we do is automatic. On the other hand, I also know quite well that you can be made aware of what you're doing.
Mhm.
And by being made aware, then you have potentially the responsibility to do something about it. And you have the skills. Most everybody has the ability to change their behavior once they see it.
Right.
It might be that you're in a spiral where it's hard to get out of it, but we have resources and we have things that can be
Yeah.
done in that situation. So
I feel that maybe it could be whether you're willing to be that personality that likes to respond rather than retaliate. So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
perhaps
yeah,
enough.
yeah.
So as we sort of wind up, I was wondering that what impact has social media and AI really had on our times and thereby on our personalities?
That's an interesting question. We are debating this quite forcefully within the field of psychology. And I know the conversation is fraught, so much so that societies are blocking children from using social media and the like. We don't have much evidence that that's justified. There isn't. This is admittedly a very hard thing to study, right? And there are lots of people running around saying that for certain subsets of society, adding social media on smartphones has led to I think one of my colleagues said it melted the brains of a whole generation, which is facetious. We do know that kids who are more depressive will end up using social media in a maladaptive way, which is not good. And so we might want to monitor those. We don't have much evidence that using social media has changed our personalities per se. Again, it's hard data to get, and you can't do a controlled experiment. And so people can point at correlational data and say, well, since 2012, these people look like this. But they haven't controlled for every other change that's happened in all of our societies. And they haven't shown that it happens across societies, for example. So at this point, I would personally argue that it hasn't done anything tangible to our personalities as a collective. The way I see it is it's kind of an accelerant. It makes us more human faster, right? So, social media, for example, I'll give you the most recent positive anecdote. This has happened to me multiple times. I'm traveling on vacation in Japan and posting so that my friends could be jealous. Look at me, I'm in Japan. It's amazing. And what happens? One of my best friends from college is in Japan. He's in Kyoto. He's staying 2 blocks from me. At the same time. I haven't seen him in 15 years. And I get an amazing experience out of that. And so social media is wonderful for that purpose, right? And so, but it's an accelerant, right? It gives you the opportunities, that you might not have had before. And I think in some respects it can be equally bad when you see people getting ostracized or being dogged on social media by trolls and the like. But what you're seeing is human nature, but just with more opportunity. And so you get the counterbalance of positive and negative, more of it, at least for those people who are on social media, which I think is becoming less likely with time, much to the consternation of those people. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that question at this point. And I'm skeptical that there is a big signal with any population that we're looking at. I do think the unregulated social media and unmindful social media is quite problematic. And we should, as societies, converse about these things. We shouldn't just let some engineer who might not have the training or the wherewithal to tell us how we should behave, because they're not that smart, at least when it comes to human nature. And they have a very strong opinion of themselves, and they think that the rest of us should concede to that. That's not a good, healthy thing. We should, as societies, be having very rich, deep conversations about how we manage these things.
Yeah. I think also this is just, everything is so new that we really don't, we're still in the early stages of knowing exactly what sort of an impact this is going to have. So we just have to wait and watch.
AI hasn't been around long enough, for example, to know. We have no clue how that's going to play out. So very curious.
So Brent, as we wrap up, what's the one thing that you'd most want our listeners to walk away with?
Hopefully,
regarding personality or
hopefully just a slightly better understanding of how we think about individual differences, how we organize them, and how they can use that to their benefit, to understand where they are in these qualities, where other people are, and how it might help them avoid problems, for example, with people, or understand the problems they have with other people, for example, would be something I would hope that people could use. And then understanding, that the developmental story that we see is relatively positive, but it's also slow, and it's not. And to avoid the easy answers and the easy arguments that you can change yourself overnight. It's not what we see in human nature. but you still could change, and it's still most likely going to be very positive, but it's going to take time. So be patient, be forgiving, and try to get as much of an understanding of yourself and your people around you as you can. Sorry, it's not one thing.
Yeah. No, thank
Hard for
you
me to
for
do one
that.
thing.
So, Brent, thank you so much for a really insightful conversation. I feel that I understood so many dimensions of really the word and the concept personality, which for me used to be a more one-dimensional understanding, and this just broadened that whole perspective. So I think it'll be really helpful and enlightening for the listeners as well. So thank you so much for coming today to the Creativity Dialogues. We really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chandana, for the excellent questions and the opportunity to talk. It was very much fun.